All right, so this is the Avenger Driveline. I just got this in the shipment a while back, I don't know, a few days ago. They shipped it pretty quick. Price was, I think, discounted a little bit. But once I received the package, this tape is just like barely hanging on. And there's actually a gap back here, missing staple. And like, you can see bags of hardware just right there. So I hope I'm not missing anything. I don't think I am, but I'm gonna finish opening this up and see. I've purchased one of these before for that red car right there, for the red YXZ, and I like the product. I think it's overpriced. I think it is engineered pretty well. I think by far the best part about it is that it has a CV shaft, a CV joint going into the rear differential. Love that feature. I think it helps with a lot of the alignment issues and things like that that the Yamaha YXZ-1000 has from the factory. All right, it looks like everything's here. They have it taped inside with this red, like red duct tape. So anyway, so there it is. I'm gonna send this to the powder coater, just the shaft part. And once I get it back, we'll start putting it in. All right, so got my Avenger drive shaft back from powder coating. Just got it coated to match. That mayhem blue is the color. And a good powder coating shop, they tape off the splines on each end, so everything's colored, but not of course the parts that have some tight tolerance. So it's kind of nice. I like it. Looks good. It's going to match the rest of the car. The Avenger Driveline comes like a silver metallic paint color or powder coat. It's very similar, maybe even the same color as like iBox springs come, or like if you get aftermarket shocks really of any kind, Fox or Shock Therapy, they all come with like it's like a gray silver metallic powder coat color. I don't know why, but I guess a lot of aftermarket brands kind of decide that that's the right color. But anyway, so if you're doing a build with aftermarket parts, your drive shaft would match those things. But anyways, so here's what comes in the box. I don't really like the shipping container that I showed you earlier, just because I don't feel like it's packed very well, and I feel like some things could come out or get damaged. But the individual baggies that these things come in is pretty well organized. It's like a vacuum wrapped. I already unwrapped them. I should have showed you, but it's sealed up and pretty good. Nothing's missing as far as I can tell. And so it's got the CV. It's got a nice billet aluminum adapter, and then this is like a boot that seals the CV. Comes with a fresh clamp, gasket, a couple of other, that's a ring for the end, or a circlip, and then these are kind of like, I guess they help keep the bolts from undoing. 6 bolts, and then these studs that have a nut on each end. Pretty complete, pretty organized. They give you a fresh sack of CV joint grease, as well as silicone to make a gasket. You got to make a gasket on one of these things, and some thread lockers. So it's a pretty complete kit. All you really need is tools. And that's it. I have removed the rear differential because if you're following along the rest of this playlist, there's many videos that I'm doing for this car, so it's a pretty complete build. I've heard that you can install the Avenger Driveline without removing the rear differential. I wouldn't want to try it that way, but I guess it's possible. So, but I'll be showing you how to do it with the driveline out. I'm going to set aside the parts I don't need. I'm going to get the driveline up, or the rear differential up here, and start taking it apart. All right, I got that differential here. Kind of gathered my tools. So if you know me, you know one of my pet peeves is aftermarket manufacturers using imperial hardware on a metric machine. So these studs are 7/16 nuts on each side, so I had to get a 7/16 wrench. The factory Yamaha pieces here, of course, are metric, so this is a 10mm nut and 5mm Allen head, and then included with the Avenger Driveline is these 6mm Allen head bolts. So they got a mix of metric and imperial with them. So again, not a big deal in your shop where you have all your tools. Really big deal when you're out in the field or on the trail or something and something breaks down and you do not have that that tool set with you. So if you do have an Avenger Driveline installed, you might want to make it a point to throw a 7/16 in your trail toolkit. Hopefully you don't have to ever tighten these in the field, but those are very important bolts that you do not want to have loose, of course. The instructions that come with the Avenger Driveline here, they're okay. It's black and white photos. It's relatively clear, and each step they just kind of have a descriptive paragraph for what you're supposed to do. So these are in pretty high demand. If you're ever on the YXZ forums or Facebook page or anything like that, like YXZ Addicts, there's always people asking for these. So this is the third time I've installed this driveline, and the first time, of course, I bought it new and I had the instructions. The second time was only a couple months ago when I put it in on Brooklyn's red and black Yamaha YXZ, and I asked online, and another member replied in like 5 minutes with these instructions. So I already saved them as a PDF, put page numbers on them, and posted them back online. But now I have a fresh paper copy with this new driveline that I bought. So I'm going to keep these in the filing cabinet. So it does say to simplify the driveline install, it is best to pull the rear differential. In order to do that, I understand you do have to actually jack the car up off the ground so that your axles have enough plunge or enough range to pop them out. So that's the first step, or the first couple of steps is how to remove that drive shaft. Now all it is just cracking loose these bolts to get this brake rotor off. So that's what I'm going to do now. I don't know how much it matters if this is in a crisscross pattern whenever you're taking them off, but that's the way I take them off. Let's see if I can round off one of these bolts while I'm at it. I did that the first time I ever installed one of these. It was a pain in the ass, to say the least. Yeah, that one's going to round off. I'm going to skip it. If you got one that's rounding off like that one is, you can see, I don't know if you want to, I could probably zoom in, but I'm not going to. Anyways, if you got one that's starting to round off, stop, because if that's the last one you have, you have more room to kind of wiggle it. Once all but one of these bolts is out, you can kind of wiggle this thing. I'm using a 10mm here. Feels a little loose, to be honest. I couldn't imagine that's not a 10mm. I don't like the idea of using an impact for this, but I don't know, for disassembly you probably could. Yeah, you can look and see those bolts really do want to round off. It's pretty soft. I don't think Yamaha intends for you to take this part of the car apart, but I don't know. I mean, this rotor is I wouldn't call it a wear item, but it's certainly something that can get worn out and it would need to be serviced or replaced. So I don't know why Yamaha is using such soft hardware. These are little lock nuts, so they have a little, like a spring lock on them. But I think this is something that should be serviceable. All right, so that's the nut that was kind of rounding off on me. Since it's the last one, you can kind of, I don't know, it might give you a little extra leeway here. Not much, but at least something that you can break the surface tension. Didn't help me any. Got lucky. Look at that guy. That nut was close to getting rounded off. Got lucky. Okay. Things a little wipe down just in case there's any kind of a little bit of surface rust on this one. No big deal. This car only has like 50 miles on it, so might be a good time to hit it with some PB Blaster or WD-40 or something like that, some sort of rust preventer. But this piece always has surface rust on it. Okay, so I'm gonna set the differential to the side here. First piece is this that gets this. This billet adapter essentially uses the rotor bolt pattern. Those six, it's going to be replaced with these longer ones, those 6 studs. One of the major advantages to the Avenger Driveline is the fact that it's not using this little bitty, I say little, it's not tiny, but this adapter or this input shaft splines there that come off of the small end of the drive shaft using these factory couplers. This is a known weak point. The drive shaft itself from the factory is weak, and then secondly, this coupler is also known to be pretty weak. There's an aftermarket one that I've used from Alba before. It's nice, and it's still just a hardened version of the same thing though. But the Avenger Driveline eliminates the need for that, and it actually transfers all the drive power and torque through this larger bolt pattern using these 6 studs. So that's the point of this, and it's just stronger. It doesn't wear out as much since it's a much larger diameter pattern. It you know, can hold a lot more torque and horsepower and things like that. That's one major advantage, I think, to the Avenger Driveline. But in my opinion, the single biggest advantage of the Avenger Driveline in itself is the fact that there is a CV joint on that, because I believe there are pretty serious alignment issues with the driveline from the factory. Whenever it meets into that spline shaft, if it's not centered perfectly, or if your chassis flexes at all, you end up with an alignment issue that I believe is responsible for many failures of this rear differential carrier bearing. That's a known weak point as well. Since this is a 2020 model, all 2019 and higher models have this cast steel carrier bearing housing. I don't think that's called a carrier bearing. Anyways, there's a bearing in here. 2016 to 2018 models, that was an aluminum piece that had a pretty well-known weak point in it, and that was an issue. There's a few aftermarket manufacturers that make an improved bearing housing. Some of those aftermarket bearing housings eliminate these two, this bracket with these 2 bolts that hold the rear brake rotor, or the rear caliper, so you lose your parking brake essentially. I think Packard has an option with or without the rear brake caliper bracket. I think the Hess and the Alba bearing housing both have the bracket on it, so you don't lose your differential, or you don't lose your caliper for the rear brake or parking brake. It's just the parking brake, it's not your rear brakes. But if you have a stick shift car or an SS, either one, you really do need a parking brake. You can live without it, but you always got to be in gear. And on the SS, you can't choose to be in gear. The computer doesn't let the car stay in gear when you're in park. Or at least if it does, it doesn't go into neutral. Or it goes in, I guess it more or less disengages the clutch. I don't know. All I know is if you don't have a parking brake, it's pretty inconvenient. You have to make sure you're parked right. If it's a drag race only type of car and you're never really doing any duning, you know, okay, that's cool. I'm down with minimizing everything. But if you're ever out in the hills, park up in a dune, or if you're a trail rider of some sort, you're going to want that parking brake. Okay, I'm doing a terrible job of spreading this silicone. I'm following the instructions here. This silicone sealant goes on the back side of this CNC ring, and it more or less creates a gasket up against the rotor. This part that I'm holding in my hand, the CNC, it's kind of the back side of where the CV joint is, and it's full of grease. So if you don't have this sealed properly, you're going to lose grease on your CV, and also it's going to sling grease all over your car in the back. So do this. If you have some other, I'm just using what's supplied with their kit here, but if you have silicone in a tube, or I'm sure like RTV or some sort of other gasket maker would work. I think that's what I used on Brooklyn's car because that was a drive shaft that I had uninstalled before, so I had to reuse some of those things. Okay, so now I am following the instructions here. Did that. So now I've got to slide these pieces together. That goes there. This goes here. Boy, I'm going to make a mess of this if I don't watch out. Just going to do myself a favor and kind of smear that on before I get it in the car, or before I get it up against the differential, just to kind of help line that up. Okay, there we go. So it's time for these studs. So they have the lock nuts on one side are already at a particular location that they want them at. And it's important that you put the loose side in. So that those pre-torqued, well, I don't know if they're pre-torqued, but they're kind of at a predetermined location, are on the inside of this little billet piece. I'm going to just thread them all through, or stick a couple of them through before I start threading any of these nuts. There is 6 of them, so you can work in 2s or in 3s, I guess, if you're trying to do things in some sort of tightening pattern. And the torque spec calls for 13 foot-pounds, which is not very much, so be careful, don't over tighten. I stripped out one of these the first time I ever installed this Avenger Driveline kit on my first Yamaha YXZ, and it took me a while to find these studs and lock nut combination, and I actually found them at Napa. My local Napa auto parts store had them. So I'm going in a crisscross pattern. Since there's 6 of them, I guess you kind of go straight across, and then you gotta So something I like to do, first of all, to be sure that you actually get your crisscross right. but also to make sure that all the bolts are torqued correctly. Sometimes in my experience, when you have a rotation, it's really a good idea to go over them more than once, because as the whole thing gets squeezed together, like your first bolt might loosen up because the other bolts on either side of it are tighter. So I kind of make it around more than once. Same torque value, still 13 pounds. I'm just trying to be thorough. Okay, gone around it twice. I'm going to do each individual one. Good. Ooh, scared me there for a minute. I thought I had to put red Loctite on all those. The Loctite is not called for on these, only because those are lock nuts already on them. So just make sure you torque them right. You'll be okay. This is something you can see after you've installed the differential and the driveline in the car. So you'll be able to just visually, when you just rotate your wheels, you'll see all 6 of these nuts and make sure that those nuts are still tight and that the same amount of threads is still being shown on those studs. Not that one of them's coming undone. And this thing spins at very high RPM. So get it right. Okay, next step is for the drive shaft. And the boot cover. So here's the shaft. It says install the band and CV shaft seal cap. So this thing goes like so. I'm gonna go ahead and put this band on first. You can open it up and put it on afterwards if you forget it, or you can come in the other end, no big deal. But all right, and then it says to put a little bit of grease on this. I am going to do that to help us get that to slide on. Okay, so I kind of slid it on. Needs to go down a little further. It goes all the way to the part that necks down. So when it comes to the whole drive shaft discussion for these cars, the factory drive shaft, from what I understand, is not really good for much more than factory power. Maybe if you do a naturally aspirated build, you know, a pipe and tune type of thing. But if you have a turbo car, you really should get the at least the factory drive shaft welded from like Allen Anderson, or if you are good with the welder, you can do it yourself, and upgrade that carrier bearing in your differential. But the next step, like in this case, is, you know, a mild turbo build, nothing crazy power, but, you know, 180, 150, something like that horsepower. You really should be putting in an aftermarket drive shaft like this Avenger. The limit, what I've heard for these though, is about 300 horsepower. I don't know from experience. I've just heard from guys that have big high horsepower drag cars with giant paddle tires, and, you know, they're running 20, 30 pounds of boost or something like that. 300 horsepower, and this part right here where it's necked down, from what I understand, it breaks if you dump the clutch off the rev limiter, or even if you have anti-lag or something like that to help you launch easier. About a 300 horsepower car will break this right here, because I mean, look, that's necked down pretty small. I don't know what the diameter is there, but maybe 3/4 of an inch, 5/8, something like that. It's bigger than 1/2 inch, but that's the weakest part of the Avenger driveline when it comes to the real high horsepower builds. So you don't see guys winning the Sand Outlaw series with an Avenger driveline. They're just not quite that high horsepower. But for most of us that, you know, have mild turbo builds, or just kind of a bolt-on naturally aspirated car, your car probably going to be fine with this Avenger, because my favorite thing about it is the alignment from the CV. Okay, I need to get my CV boot tool. This is a handy tool for CV boot bands. I can't remember where I got this. It was not very expensive, but it helps pull this nice and tight. You can do this with a pair of pliers and a screwdriver if you need to. You know, if I were real good, I would have paid attention to which way that spins, and I didn't cut that off quite as close as I should have. Let's see, this spins. Okay, I got lucky. So the drive shaft spins this way. So while this band is turning, it's turning with the wind, I guess, is kind of what I'm going to say. Okay. Next step is to squeeze grease into this CV joint. So it says to put grease in both sides of the CV, but it does matter which way it goes on the car. Best way I can tell is, see this side, it pretty much splines go straight to that little beveled surface. Then on this side, you kind of have this ring around it, and it's like the balls are further in there. The balls are less visible. So this side, from what I understand, is what is outside. So the drive shaft goes in like this, and then you put a snap ring on it like here. So I'm gonna put grease on the back side first, I guess. I'm gonna try not to make a big old mess, so I'm just gonna kind of okay. So now just for alignment purposes, I'm going to slide 2 of these bolts in here. Well, I'm trying to if you had a vise or a clamp of some sort to hold the drive shaft for you, it'd be better. In this situation, I just happen to be straddling it between my legs. So I kind of spun some grease around in there to get that CV nice and lubed up on all the little ball bearings and everything in there. Once the drive shaft is installed, it's probably not going to get much, and it's going to spin, but it's not going to get much of the bearing, you know, I guess up and down, left, right type action. So you really want to get those balls nice and covered. Okay, so I got this C-clip, goes on the end. Well, the pliers won't let me get close enough. There we go. And this is probably not necessary, but I do it every time I install a clip. So I flip the pliers around and I pull it. I know they're not really meant to work like this, but I do it anyways. This way I kind of pull that clip together. Okay. All right. So next step is to fill the remainder of the grease on all the splines. So now I'm going to put grease on this end, on the transmission end. I'm going to smear a little grease around there and then rub it around. Again, this is all the packet that was included with this drive shaft or drive line. I will clean out and check it under the car too on what's on the transmission side, but just get it in there. Oh, and I just realized I got a boot I'm supposed to put on here. That's gonna be good and messy. Okay, and then the rest of the grease, you just fill this void on this end. So I still got like half a package of grease here. I'm just gonna put it all in there. That kind of packs, as it heats up, it'll pack more into the bearings that way. I'm going to be careful not to get it all over the mating surface because I do have to squeeze a gasket onto one of these ends. Okay, well, I'm going to finish smearing this grease around in there, and then I will get under the car and get ready to slide this puppy in. I almost forgot this step is to put the silicone on the differential side of this adapter plate before I get under the car. I used all the silicone that was included in that little packet on the other side, so I just have this tube of it sitting around here at the shop. Maybe. I guess that's gonna work. We'll see. I wish they had better, I guess, sealing or gasket solutions here than squeezing silicone on. Okay, so here I'm under the car. Everything's nice and clean. Like I said, it's a brand new machine. This is the factory boot. It only goes on one way because it's the output shaft of the transmission is bigger. So it kind of holds it. There is no clamp or tie or anything that holds it on there. It's just kind of pressure. You do have to slide the drive shaft in from the tail end of the car. I just laid a rag out so that it doesn't get all scratched up. And now it's just a matter of putting it in the hole. So from the factory, the original drive shaft has a spring in there, and according to Avenger, you're not supposed to use the spring. It's not mentioned in their instructions anywhere. And the reason why that's not a problem is, so in the factory drive shaft, it's kind of floating between the transmission and the rear differential. and there's a spring on this end, and there's a little rubber bumper on that end in the differential. And so since the Avenger driveline is actually bolted to that CV joint that is bolted to the rear differential, it doesn't float. It is bolted that way, and it will stay that way. It still might, just with chassis flex, it still might move in and out of this, but not much. I mean, I couldn't imagine it moving more than a few millimeters one way or the other. But it's not floating anymore. So this sound, like if you're driving and your chassis flexes with a floating drive shaft and you don't have the spring in there, the drive shaft will hit. It'll kind of plunge. So the Avenger drive shaft does not do that. It's not supposed to, because it is actually bolted to one end. It doesn't float. Okay, now it's time to put in the differential. All right, so now I'm in the back of the car here, got the drive shaft. Still just have those two bolts in it, just kind of there for alignment purposes. And it's time to fasten the differential. I'll go ahead and hang it in here. It's pretty heavy. In my opinion, it's worth having a jack, which I just realized I don't have here with me. If you're just one person doing it, you can do it with two people pretty easily, or you can do it without a jack, but it's pretty stressful. I don't know what this thing weighs, but enough that trying to hang it up there and get the bolts lined up and everything is a bit of a booger if you're by yourself. So I'm gonna try to be careful not to come in contact with all that goop I have on the front of this differential while I'm putting it in. And all you're really shooting for is to get these holes to line up and slide those bolts in just to hold the weight. Once they line up, you can get everything else kind of in place pretty easily. So that's the maximum of my jack. I'm just going to try to get these okay. So now the stress, the weight is off of me really. It's just a matter of getting these together without mixing the silicone and the grease too much. Yeah, this is why I wish they had a better gasket solution here. This is kind of sloppy. I mean, literally sloppy, but also really not a good way to seal. Okay, so all I did is just have 2 bolts, kind of a few threads in. Now I'm going to take these, it's the little brackets that are included, and I've got 2 of the long hex head bolts, and I'm going to put them all the way in. I'm not going to torque them yet, but a little bit of red Loctite. I'm not using the pouch that came with this kit, but they did include red thread locker. I'm going to let that run around the threads a little bit. So obviously, since they include this little bracket, you have to do the 2s, you know, 2 at a time. You don't have to torque them and tighten them all the way, but you have to at least put them in together. As you see, I am struggling to do. All right, so that took some struggle, but what I did is I put 1 bolt in each of these little metal retainer clip type things. I put 1 in each, so there's 3 of those retainers in with 1 bolt in each with Loctite on it. It is not torqued. It is not even really tightened. It's just kind of finger tight in there. So I was able to manage that to keep it all aligned. Now I'm going to go around, put final bolts in with Loctite on them, and kind of got messy also because as I suspected, I put too much of that silicone on there, so it squeezed out the edges a little bit. No big deal. And the only angle I can get on, so I've got a 3/8 drive 3/8 drive ratchet with an extension and a 6mm Allen head, and I just line that up on the bottom, and you can pass the ratchet through and be able to swing it. All right, so all 6 of them are in. Now I'm going in like a star pattern to, I'm basically firming them up. I'm not tightening them. I'm not torquing them. I'm just tightening them by hand with the ratchet. I'm going to get the torque wrench and start I'm going to get something like a, I don't know, a punch or a screwdriver or something to put through this rotor to keep it from spinning. And I'm going to get the torque wrench out. Book calls for 19 foot-pounds of torque. So I just got like a little punch here. You could find many things in your shop and many places to put it in here to block, but all I'm doing is putting that in there and then rotating it till it hits. So back here on the back side of the car, actually, you know what, I'm gonna put it some other place. Let me think here. It's gonna rotate that way. Perfect. Parking brake hole lines up just fine. Okay, so I'm just reaching through, doing the underside. Same way I got the ratchet in. And 19 foot-pounds. Just like most things that are round when you're torquing, go in a rotating pattern, star pattern of some sort. Almost there, and then I kind of go around a second time. Okay, so that's it. I'm gonna go around again, torque them one more time. I'm going to clean it up, and we'll finish bolting in this differential. It's just kind of hanging in there loose right now. All right, got that differential in, got everything torqued, or got the driveline in, everything torqued up. Now I'm just going to tighten up the factory bolts for the differential. All I did earlier was just slide in these factory bolts when I was lifting it, so it's all still kind of loose. There is a washer on each one of these long bolts, so make sure you get the washer on each side, the bolt, as well as the nut side. Both have washers. And this is something I talked about earlier. One of the big advantages for the Avenger Driveline is the fact that it has a CV joint, so a constant velocity joint can move in many directions, so it doesn't just spin like a U joint. Well, it works just like a U joint in that it can spin on many different axes, but the bigger benefit of a CV joint is that it's got ball bearings in there, and it can handle more speed, more angles, I guess. So that's why they're typically used like here on axles. But you don't ever really use much of the angle coming through the drive shaft. But the fact that it has a joint that can effectively rotate at a bit of off of an angle, that really helps, because there's an alignment issue, in my opinion, and I've talked to others that agree. So you can tell just in the factory holes, this rear differential has a few degrees of slop. So, you can't really tell what is dead center, because, you got a center line coming from the front of this differential to the back of the transmission. And the factory drive shaft only uses those little splines. So it's pretty tight tolerance. And if it's a little bit off 1 degree or the other, your splines are not designed to work off angle like that, and you'll have a whole lot of stress on one side of the bearing, because it's kind of like pushing up against one side of that shaft or whatever. And that's a big reason I think there's a lot of rear differential failures for the YXZ, especially of course if you have higher horsepower. But even factory power guys or low power guys, after a few thousand miles, they'll break a differential. So the CV joint that's in the Avenger Driveline eliminates that, and I believe that is a very significant feature, and I believe that's why it makes the Avenger Driveline the best aftermarket driveline solution for guys that ride their YXZs, either in the dunes or the trails. Or point is it's you're putting thousands of miles on it. Now the drag race guys are different. 300 horsepower or so is where these Avenger Drivelines I've heard of break. That's not enough horsepower. A lot of the big winners are putting at least double that down. There's a lot of guys putting 600. I've heard close to 700 or 800 horsepower now to the wheels. Guys, that is incredibly massive power for a 1-liter engine. So point is that's a whole nother discussion for them. They have different drive lines altogether. But for the Avenger customer, your typical rider that has more horsepower than normal and wants it to last for thousands of miles of dunes and trails and riding like that, I think the CV joint is the biggest advantage that it has over all the other options that are out there. Okay, so this is just factory nut washer. Goes on the other side. These are all 17 millimeter nuts and bolts. Just kind of hand threading them. They do not call for Loctite. The nuts are lock nuts, and I think as long as you torque them to spec, they'll be just fine. Before you get anything tight, you want to kind of you just kind of start them, if you will, by hand. And this little bracket goes in the back. It's kind of a funny angle piece, so you want to get it in before you tighten anything, because you need that sloppy play to work to your advantage. So it goes in like this. And if you have the book, which I highly recommend you should have the book, the diagram is in there for all of these things, as well as all the torque numbers. So this is a 17 millimeter nut and bolt, just like these top two are 17 millimeter. These two in the back are, I believe, 14. Yes, these two back here are 14 millimeter, and they go through some holes on the frame and into those threaded nuts on the bracket. And like I said, this one takes a little bit of pushing and pulling. Okay, so those are the first ones I've actually put some oomph on. And now I'm gonna do it on this one. Through a little bit. Washers are directional, guys. You can debate me. Okay, so 17 millimeter. Not a professional. You might want to watch out and not do what I just did. Scratch the paint a little bit. Okay, not torquing those yet. Now we're going to do this parking brake rotor. So this thing is pretty simple. 2 bolts through this bracket. By the way, YXZs are known for their parking brake, the handbrake, to become ineffective after just a few hundred miles. Your parking brake pads are not worn out. in almost every situation. It just needs adjustment. There's adjustment on this cable, I believe, somewhere, or you can adjust it here with, this is the lock nut. You loosen it, you tighten that, and you undo the lock nut again, or then you tighten the lock nut back down. Takes 5 minutes, and your park and brake works again. So do not order new brake pads after 200 miles. Ooh, I'm gonna spray that thing down a little bit. Okay, cleaned it up a little bit. Goodness. See? Finagling. Mm, 14 millimeter. Not a professional. Okay, I am not torquing anything down quite yet. I'm going to get the book out, get my torque wrench out. Here is the cable. It's usually pretty simple. Got good length on it, so that's what she said. Okay. All right, that's that. Don't forget this vent hose. It's important that your rear differential has efficient venting, because when it heats up, the oil heats up and the air and stuff expands in there, and it'll pressurize, and if your vent is not working, it'll blow these seals out. It'll squirt oil and stuff will get out right here, make a mess all over your car. So this hose, make sure it's not kinked or anything like that. It goes up, follows up here, and then it goes behind the passenger seat in the plastics and does a little loop. If you ride in deep water or mud or anything like that, make sure that stays up high. You know, like the factory location is about, I don't know, maybe about the, it's higher than the butt of your passenger seat. So what is that? Maybe the height of the shoulders, or a little bit lower than your shoulders. Okay. All right. So I'm going to get the book out, check the torque values, and I'm just going to go around and torque all of those bolts. All right. These big bolts are, by the way, this is on page, section 8, page 19 of the, and 19 and 20 of the service manual book. It's in the driveline section. It's not in the rear suspension section, which is of course where I was looking, because I've been working on this stuff. So 105 Newton meters, which is 77 foot-pounds. And I always go by the Newton meters because it's metric, and I think it makes more sense. I need a more effective holding solution on the other side. There we go. All right, and I suspect this one is the same. Yes, also 105 Newton meters. It's gonna be kind of tricky because I'm using an extension. And they have just enough bolt coming through that I have to use a deep socket. You may be able to get away with not a deep socket. Some companies, I think Snap-on makes a like a mid socket, a mid depth socket, which is really cool. A good friend of mine has some of those. Okay, that's all the big ones. Now, these two small ones. Are not on that page. Yes, they are. These two back here are 55 Newton meters. And they're 14 millimeter. This is a pretty inexpensive torque wrench from Home Depot. Like all of my tools are from AutoZone and Home Depot type stuff. Nothing crazy fancy or anything for me. I like it. It works. I got 3 different sizes. And 55. Okay. And the warranty was pretty good. Okay, and I'm sure you've noticed I like to give it a couple of clicks. I don't continue turning it, but I give it a couple of clicks. And so the brake line is on a different page. Okay, parking brake bolts are 40 Newton meters. That's on section 4, page 52. Okay. Okay, there it is. Done with this driveline and rear differential reinstallation. I'm now going to proceed with finishing this rear suspension. Looking forward to it. And gonna be pretty cool. Really getting done with this car. I think it's gonna be nice. And I'm gonna give this thing a few turns here, just so you hear a little bit of friction. That's just the brake pads. And there we go. Completed.